Yeah, well, there's a saying in the space that nobody has enough Bitcoin, right? But and what's enough to go around? We'll see. It's finite resource, the 21 million forever. So get it while you can. And I'm sure there'll always be some level, some fraction of a Bitcoin that you can purchase out there in the marketplace. But, the sooner the better for folks when they get in. And the same for these states, right? Like in a decade, when they look back and they start calculating the impact that a strategic Bitcoin reserve has had on states like New Hampshire and Arizona, a lot more states are going to wish that they had got in when New Hampshire and Arizona did. The insurance is always cheaper when you're earliest to buy it. And so if you want to get insurance against the loss of purchasing power for taxpayer money, today is the best time, and you should be moving as quickly as possible to go that direction.
In today's episode, we'll be talking with Dennis Porter, bringing you an exclusive interview. Dennis is the CEO and co-founder of the Satoshi Act Fund. You can find out more what they got going on at satoshiaction.io. Dennis's team is dedicated to educating policymakers about the transformative potential of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. You can also get plugged in with the Satoshi Action Fund and follow them on X at Satoshi Act Fund. Dennis's team is trying to shape the future of Bitcoin policy while trying to bridge the gap between Bitcoiners and the political world through state legislation. Let's dive into the conversation.
So firstly, before we get started, the Bitcoin Bros wanted to take time to welcome you to the channel and also thank you for taking time out of us to discuss what's been going on at the Satoshi Act Fund and what's the current temperature of policymakers in the U.S. when it comes to Bitcoin legislation. So just wanted to welcome you, Dennis.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, glad to be here and excited to have this conversation about all the recent updates in the policy space.
Cool. So let's get into it. So firstly, history in the making, New Hampshire and Arizona passing their strategic Bitcoin reserve bills. There's been a lot going on to get these bills in order. We know there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to getting these bills into law. But can you speak to what strategy you and your team utilized when working with these policymakers to assist to ensure that these get done and passed? For instance, when it comes to Arizona, we know that there was actually a bill that got vetoed first, and then shortly thereafter, there was one that passed. So just hoping to shed some light on what that overall strategy and process looked like and the difference of the actual bill that got vetoed versus the one that got passed.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. Really exciting time to have, for the first time ever, not only just one, but two strategic Bitcoin reserve bills pass into law. It's something that we have been fighting for and advocating for a while at Satoshi Action. We actually have it pinned to the very top of our Satoshi Action Twitter account that we will pass a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill into law. And we've been able to come through on that promise. But it wasn't just Satoshi Action that was in the trenches fighting to make this a reality. We also had the lawmakers, Representative Ammon in New Hampshire, Representative Weninger in Arizona, fighting to make sure that strategic Bitcoin reserve legislation had a chance and was able to get across the finish line and in the House and the Senate and then signed by the governor. Up in New Hampshire, they were the first ones to get it done. And I'll say, man, I couldn't be more excited for Representative Ammon being the first one to get strategic Bitcoin reserve bill across the finish line because he was actually the first lawmaker ever to introduce Satoshi Action model policy. And going into the strategy side of things, to sort of give people an idea of what that means is we craft, not only do we educate lawmakers and regulators, but we craft models, we draft language, and we put it in front of lawmakers. We say, well, now that you love Bitcoin as much as we do, let's go out there and fight for a way for your state to be a leader on this technology. It started with Bitcoin rights. We passed that in 7 states now, where it protects the right to self-custody, the right to mine, the right to run a node, the right to peer-to-peer transactions. And then now we've moved on to this second phase of policy. But as we're going through this process of putting these policies in front of lawmakers, it takes time, it takes work, and it takes a lot of trust that you have to build between lawmakers that you're a good source of information, you're a good resource, and you're someone that can help them get that policy win. And it was Representative Keith Ammon, who was the very, very first lawmaker that ever put his trust in us at Satoshi Action to introduce and utilize some of our draft language in the past that we worked on him with on the Bitcoin mining side of things. And now he's the first lawmaker to pass this into law in New Hampshire. So it's really exciting for us to see him be the one to get that win. Funny enough, he was also the lawmaker of the year at Satoshi Action. I mean, this is how much we love Keith Ammon, right? He's a legend. He was working on this stuff when, FTX was collapsing and before, despite everyone saying, you're crazy. What is this Bitcoin stuff? He continued to advocate for Bitcoin in his state. And now he, for all the time being, will have that stamp of approval, that badge of honor to be the first to ever pass it into law there in the state. But it takes a lot of work, not just us, the lawmakers. We also worked with the New Hampshire Blockchain Council. They did a lot of great work there on the ground. And then the Majority Leader Osborne played a key role as well in helping to get it out of the Senate and in front of the governor and signed into law. So it was awesome to just see all these groups come together and support this bill so that we could get this big win. And now it's going to be a lot easier to pass it in other states. In fact, 48 hours later, less than 48 hours later, Arizona passes it into law, and Katie Hobbs becomes the first Democrat governor to sign that type of legislation into law. And Representative Winiger came up with a great model for that one. It was using an unclaimed property fund. Anything that's in there that's a digital asset, if you generate revenue off that fund, and they allow the state to do that with this bill, that revenue that's generated off the fund, but you buy Bitcoin with it to put it in the strategic Bitcoin reserve. I mean, it's totally budget neutral. So really creative way to get that done. And Representative Winiger definitely deserves an award himself for most creative strategic Bitcoin reserve approach.
Yeah, so when it comes to New Hampshire and Arizona's strategic Bitcoin reserves, moving forward, we've heard, there's the Lummis bill where the federal government talks about potentially plans of having 1 million Bitcoin over a given time frame and what that looks like. And then in the institutional world, there's a lot that's been going on there in the corporate space where institutions have been laying out their roadmaps to acquire X amount of Bitcoins in their treasury for their respective companies. Are those conversations happening at the state level? What does that look like? Has that conversation been had, or is it starting to be had for Arizona and or New Hampshire? What's the temperature from that lens?
Right. So as soon as we pass this legislation into law, it gives the Treasurer the ability to purchase Bitcoin in the unclaimed property approach. Obviously, it gives them the ability to use that unclaimed property to purchase Bitcoin. So it's going to take a couple months at least for these bills to become effective. I believe the New Hampshire one is 60 days. So 60 days after the bill goes into effect, the treasurer can buy Bitcoin. But it's really important, and it's something that I've been trying to make sure that people understand, is that these treasurers, they need to be educated on Bitcoin just as much as everyone else. And people need to be cautious in the way that they approach the treasurer and cautious in the way they approach the state. Because, although we're very excited about Bitcoin, we just need to make sure that we start at the very basics, the very fundamentals, and that we all don't try to rush in and try to pitch these people over and over again. They don't want to be pitched. They want to learn. They want to be educated. And then when their time is right, that's when they'll be allocating into Bitcoin. We hope that time comes soon. But that's phase 2 of the project, right? And that could happen very quickly, but it could also take time. But some treasurers will be different than others, right? Like there are treasurers that we work with that own Bitcoin already themselves in other states. And so they might be willing to purchase Bitcoin much faster once these bills are passed into law. And we certainly hope that this is going to add a boost to the federal level as well. I think, obviously the states are more important when it comes to the strategic Bitcoin reserve. And I'll tell you why, because they don't have an unlimited budget. They don't have an unlimited money printer. So they can't just continue to navigate with this sort of get out of jail free card that the federal government has when it comes to their budget. States have finite amount of resources. They tax their constituents, they tax their residents in order to be able to have the resources to pay for the things they need. But because of inflation, the tax money that they've been getting it's just not making ends meet anymore like it used to. And so these lawmakers are dealing with a lot of pain. We did a paper and it showed that since 2018 alone, if you would have held dollars, let's say you had $100, it's now worth $75 in purchasing power. It lost 25% of its purchasing power in just since 2018 alone. And that hurts the average American. But think about these states. They're trying to pay for the roads, they're trying to pay for the schools, trying to pay for healthcare, and all of a sudden 25% of their purchasing power just went away. So what we did is we did a paper to show if they would have just bought a little bit of Bitcoin, just a tiny little bit of Bitcoin, then they could have combated 100% of that loss of purchasing power. So the allocation, all they had to make was just a 3% allocation. It's a very small allocation. And they would have been able to make sure that they have the budget lined up with the programs and that they're getting the right resources in place. If they don't do that, which most of them obviously didn't, right? The alternative is they have to raise taxes or cut programs. And we're seeing that happen all over the country, especially in states where they had a little more trouble with their budget. Some states did better than others. There's some states out there that certainly don't have some fiscal problems. But even if you don't have fiscal problems, because of the inflation that took place, maybe you were able to outcompete inflation with the way that you run your budget. All that money you're sitting on as a state is just losing purchasing power. It's a melting ice cube. And so by having some Bitcoin, they can continue to combat and protect taxpayer money now and far into the future with a strategic Bitcoin reserve.
I definitely agree. Most people, when it comes to the retail side, they're talking about inflation, food prices, rents, just the cost of living going up across the board. But the other side of the coin where people don't really think about is, how much it costs to, run a state budget is, or how much it actually costs to do some of these initiatives that you're talking about, just to keep, things moving business as usual, keep making sure roads stay paved and such. So when that melting ice cube, continues to expedite that 25% since 2018, that's a huge deficit and loss in purchasing power, 100%. So to piggyback on that, when it comes to what states are looking for their strategic Bitcoin treasuries or their treasuries in general, are they looking solely at Bitcoin, or are there other digital assets? Is Ethereum being talked about? We do know that, obviously there's an ETF that's passed there. Are those conversations being had, or is it just solely Bitcoin at this time?
So the two states that passed this, let's focus on New Hampshire for a second. In New Hampshire, the bill says that the assets that they can allocate by the treasurer into the fund have to be worth over $500 billion or more. And today that's only Bitcoin by a long shot. Ethereum would have to go up by 250% in order to be able to get to that number, because they just aren't even close. And honestly, Ethereum is even struggling as it stands now. I mean, I know it's had a recent price spike, but when you compare it to Bitcoin, it has lost against Bitcoin for several years now. So certainly, obviously, this enables treasurers to be able to allocate into resources outside of Bitcoin. But today, for the foreseeable future, it's only Bitcoin, and it's what we're advocating for. But the reason that lawmakers write policy like that, we actually give them the option. We say, do you want to do Bitcoin only? Do you want to do market cap threshold, which is the idea that we came up with? And they typically pick one or the other. In this case, these lawmakers picked market cap thresholds because there's a difference between convincing one lawmaker to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve, like Representative Keith Hammond. He loves the idea. He wants to do it. So did 20 plus other lawmakers across the United States, 20 plus different states. But it's a different thing to go from one lawmaker wanting to do it to getting the entire legislature on board. 51% in the House and 51% in the Senate. In New Hampshire, that's over 200 people. You got to go from one guy to 200 plus people, because their Congress, their House and their Senate, I should say, is like 440 plus, I believe, something along the lines. It's like the third largest legislative body in the country, in the world. So they have to make sure that they're crafting these policies in a way that they know they can get them across the finish line. And time again, when we've been working with lawmakers, they found that the market cap threshold is much more politically possible. And at the end of the day, politics is the art of the possible. Now, we want to go as far as we possibly can. And I think at the state we're at right now, having the ability for treasurers to buy Bitcoin, that's very, very far along. That is cutting edge policy. But as we go and we move forward, there's probably going to be more lawmakers that want to just do Bitcoin only versions. And there's going to be more lawmakers who have been educated on Bitcoin. And then we also have talked about raising the cap. We personally do 750 billion as our model. Representative Keith Hammond did 500 billion as the version in New Hampshire. But we'll raise the cap as Bitcoin gets bigger, peg it to inflation or something like that. That's how we get these things done. Is we don't just say, wow, this is the ultimate prize, let's get that done. We work ourselves towards that ultimate prize, and we take steps towards it so that we can ultimately achieve the best, most efficient use case of Bitcoin. And states certainly are putting that use case in effect now with bills like this, because they can actually now use Bitcoin to protect themselves from the runaway monetary debasement that has taken place over the last decade, really over the last 50, 70 years. And that's an incredible thing for states to be able to do. And we look forward to helping other states. We look forward to helping all 50 states get it done.
It seems like that's on the horizon. Is there a particular data point behind the metric of the 500 billion that was landed upon as far as the cap goes?
There was no specific. It was, make it high enough to make it difficult to achieve. Like, we certainly don't want it to be easy. And it's actually not just the 500 billion in the New Hampshire version and the 750 billion in our version. You also have to maintain that market cap for over 12 months. So it's an average of the 12 months. So you can't just jump up over a day or 2 days and be able to be included. You have to be able to sustain that. But no, there's no specific reason why we chose those numbers, other than just that we didn't want to pick something that was so close to the current market cap of Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin's at 2 trillion and you pick 1.8 trillion and then it slips below 1.8 trillion, then you could be in trouble. So 750 billion, you feel like a good, sort of middle ground approach on how to take it. But we're absolutely interested in raising that, or just shifting to a Bitcoin only version in the future as we get enough lawmakers to understand the importance of Bitcoin versus all the other digital assets out there.
Definitely makes sense. And then to pivot from the Bitcoin conversation to the stablecoin bill, recently there was a bill that failed to clear a key hurdle in the U.S. Senate. It's in the vote. It seemed that there were 49 senators that voted to advance the bill, but it fell short of the 60 votes that was needed. What's your thoughts as to will this give pushback on the strategic Bitcoin reserve bill at the federal level, and also how this stablecoin bill will be massaged to make it make sense to get that approval?
Yeah, it's a great question. We saw the Senate cloture vote, which would have meant that they could move forward with debate on the Genius bill in the Senate. That they didn't hit the amount that they needed. They lost all of the Democrat support that they had previously built up. For me, my viewpoint is really just that we're entering a very political environment, and it's as we go further along in time, it could become more difficult to get Democrats on board. When I speak to Democrats, I know there's a lot of concern around, Trump launching a meme coin, Trump launching a stable coin, and that's really given a lot of ammunition to folks like Elizabeth Warren and others that don't want to see these types of policies move forward. They are very, Liz Warren is the leader of the anti-crypto army. And so that's given her camp a lot of ammunition, and that's applied a lot of pressure politically. Now, that's not the only reason why we saw the vote go this way. Of course, Democrats were also saying that there were parts of the new version that were put out by the Haggerty office that they did not agree with. I'm not sure which parts specifically that they were, upset about. I think there needs to be a really strong debrief on that, and we plan to engage offices there in Washington, D.C. and figure out how to get in a good place where we can move forward on stablecoin legislation, market structure, and hopefully eventually SBR. Does it hurt the ability to get an SBR across the finish line? I already kind of assumed that the policy process might start slowing down soon, so it doesn't come too much of a surprise to me based off my conversations that I was having. But for people that were not aware of, sort of the dynamics that are happening in Washington, D.C. and the concerns that are taking place and that are not paying too much attention to politics, it probably did come as a surprise, and they would probably view this as a slowing down of our ability to get to SBR. My mind was already sort of there that we were going to be going this slow soon. Hopefully we can get it back to a great place, though, and we can speed these things back up. I would love to see a lot more collaboration between Republicans and Democrats on market structure so we don't have this problem again. I know there was a lot of input from Democrats that even co-sponsored the Genius bill, but I think there needs to be a continued and renewed push to make sure that both sides are able to participate. Because, as an interview that I was just in recently, we got to have bipartisan support for this type of legislation if we want it to be successful and we want it to be durable. You need 60 votes in the Senate to move past the cloture vote. So you're going to need to get both sides on board there. And then if you want to make sure that, let's say we get this bill done, House, Senate, we send it to the president, he signs it. If you want the bill to be durable and to last a long time, you also need to make sure that you had bipartisan support on the way there. Otherwise, when Team Red, eventually one day, we don't know when it'll be, could be 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, when they lose to Team Blue might want to come in and undo some stuff because they didn't like what the Republicans did. So that's something to be cautious of and aware of. And that's also not an outcome that we want. And that's why at Satoshi Action, we've always been pushed very aggressively for bipartisan action on digital asset legislation, Bitcoin legislation. We are very good at getting Republicans and Democrats to see the value and agree on the value and vote in favor and pass into law, not only strategic Bitcoin reserve legislation, but things like Bitcoin rights. Governor Katie Hobbs and Governor Ayotte are on the opposite sides of the political spectrum. One is Republican, one's a Democrat. They both signed that legislation into law. We just had our Bitcoin rights pass in Utah. We had it pass in Kentucky, but we also have it on the way in California, where the chair of banking and finance sponsored that legislation or authored that legislation, and it passed unanimously out of the committee there, predominantly from Democrats. So super important that we get both sides on board. We need to make sure that we're moving forward and not taking steps backward. And that's why we got to have bipartisan action. And will it slow down strategic Bitcoin reserve legislation? The fact that we had this slowdown in the Senate with the Genius bill, maybe a little bit. But at the end of the day, I still feel very optimistic about getting legislation across the finish line in this Congress.
Yeah, it definitely has to be unified bipartisan bill that, where both sides can, meet in the middle and make it all make sense for everybody involved. It sounds like when you're talking about the slowness there, where politics and policy and process can maybe impede progress a little bit there. But, back to the good news, we did get 2 states that, did get this bill passed, which is definitely historic and symbolic. Symbolic from the lens that it now put pressure on other states to get their bills passed. Do you believe that the state level Bitcoin reserve strategy can create that competition or like that fear of missing out when it comes to other states getting this pushed in. It seems like for other big initiatives such as, some women's rights, cannabis, some fintech movements, that it started at the state level before it sort of bubbles up. So maybe there'll be FOMO at the state level in the United States. What's your thoughts on that?
That's absolutely right, Sean. And that's a great insight. There are a lot of political movements that start at the state level here in America. It's a very unique function or feature that we have in this country. There's nowhere else in the world where we have a similar dynamic where crucial legislation can move forward at the state level and even be in conflict with federal law and yet still continue to move forward. That's the beauty of the design of the United States. And it's why we've been so successful at Satoshi Action, because we follow that same pattern. The cannabis industry, a woman's right to vote, the civil rights movement, all of these things started at the state level. They all pushed for their cause at the state level and won, and then eventually they saw federal action in response to the progress that they were making. We see that happening with cannabis right now. We saw it happen with the civil rights movement and a woman's right to vote. Both of those things were big victories for our country, but really only started because of the incubation, or it happened a lot sooner at least, right? Maybe they would have happened further down the road, but they happened a lot faster because advocates realized that states are the most effective and most efficient way to advocate for their cause. And at Satoshi Action, we are excited to be leading that charge with digital assets and Bitcoin and that's why we started, right? Like nobody else was doing it the way that we thought needed to be done. So we brought together a stellar team. We've grown since launching, but we're continuing to fight every day because we deeply care about the United States being a leader on this technology.
Definitely agree, 1000%. So let's pivot from that conversation and just so this is your own personal opinion. When it comes to these states pushing for this legislation to get in place, and there's going to be different temperatures as far as, one state might be more aggressive than the other based on, their own personal strategy on how they're going to acquire Bitcoin moving forward. But looking out 5-10 years, when there'll be definitely more bills that'll be passed, the federal government may have their SPR enabled. Other global governments will probably be hopping on board, institutions globally. Do you believe there'll be enough Bitcoin to go around for all these big players?
Yeah, well, there's a saying in the space that nobody has enough Bitcoin, right? But and what's enough to go around? We'll see. It's finite resource, the 21 million forever. So get it while you can. And I'm sure there'll always be some level, some fraction of a Bitcoin that you can purchase out there in the marketplace. But, the sooner the better for folks when they get in. And the same for these states, right? Like in a decade, when they look back and they start calculating the impact that a strategic Bitcoin reserve has had on states like New Hampshire and Arizona, a lot more states are going to wish that they had got in when New Hampshire and Arizona did. The insurance is always cheaper when you're earliest to buy it. And so if you want to get insurance against the loss of purchasing power for taxpayer money, today is the best time and you should be moving as quickly as possible to go that direction.
Yeah, everybody should be buying as of yesterday. So what's next as far as what states are on the radar? Are you able to share which regions are showing serious momentum on, going the same path that Arizona and New Hampshire have? And then looking out at the end of this year, at the end of 2025, are you seeing like a benchmark where we could maybe potentially have, 5 bills, 5 states that are on board, 10 states? What's that look like?
With this year alone, 2025, a lot of states have already come to the the end of their legislative cycle. So states are only part-time. Some of them are full-time, some of them are year-round, but most of them are part-time. And we saw a lot of bills fail this year, but that's pretty normal, especially with cutting-edge policy like this. Like you don't take cutting edge ideas and pass them in 20 states. You get lucky if you pass it in one, and it's a big win if you pass it in 3 or 4. We've passed it in 2, so we're past the single state benchmark, which I think is a requirement if you want to get people still interested in the idea. Because if you can't get one done, then that's a pretty big flop. You got to come through on your campaign promises at least a little bit. So we got one state. We say at the top of our Satoshi Action Fund account on Twitter that we will pass a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill into law. We've done that. We got a second state with Arizona. That's big because then people always wonder, are you going to be a one-hit wonder? Or are you just going to do this one time? So the second state is almost as important as the first state. And of course, getting it done by governors that are on opposite ends of the political spectrum, I think is a massive win. And I don't think people have really calculated how positive of an impact that will have on policy conversations all across the country. Additionally, we have North Carolina, we have Texas, We have Ohio and maybe even Pennsylvania this year that'll continue to work on this legislation. North Carolina, it's sponsored by the Speaker. So the Speaker of the House is the one carrying the bill there. He's very high up, and he is providing a lot of political support for that bill. It already passed out of the House. It's going over to the Senate now, so we'll see how it does over there, but we feel very good about it. Same with Ohio. It's the majority whip who's behind the bill there. Representative Demetrio, great guy. He is working on getting that thing spun up. It's got a little bit more time to go, but we feel like there's a lot of political support in Ohio. The same with Pennsylvania. We got Rep. Ledbetter there doing a great job building the political support necessary to make this thing become a reality. And then in Texas, Chairman Capriglione has done an amazing job. He's got it over there just out of the committee just now. It was great. I previously was on a Spaces with him when he launched his version of the bill. Of course, it's been sort of maneuvered around, and you've got the SB 21 now on the Senate side, which is the sort of main piece of legislation. But the Lieutenant Governor came out in favor of that legislation, and we're feeling very positive about it happening in Texas. So I'd say North Carolina, Texas are the top two that could be next, and then Ohio and Pennsylvania after that. And then we'll go right back around to 2026. I mean, we're halfway through the year almost already. And so we'll be gearing up for next year's policy conversations and getting those model bills ready to go. And I'm sure after we pass 2 this year at least, we'll pass probably at least 3 or 4 next year. But if we pass 4 or 5 this year, I mean, that really increases the odds that we can get quite a bit done the next year. The more momentum you build, the more momentum you have. And we've got quite a bit of momentum now with the 2 bills. That's enough to carry us forward for quite a while. But if we got 4, I mean, that would be huge. That would make a massive difference for many of these other states coming on board.
A lot of big things going on behind the scenes. It's crazy because, we've been in the Bitcoin and crypto space since 2016. And this was something back then that just was sort of like dreamed of these bills getting passed. And now this year it's actually came to fruition. And it's sort of the mantra, gradually, then suddenly. So it seems like, the momentum and the ball is starting to roll there in the States. So we talked about, on the domestic side in the U.S., but this is going to have some major global implications as well. And correct me if I'm misspeaking, there has been some international influence when it comes to nation states that may have been reaching out to you and your team and, inquiring on, potentially how can we get this, strategic Bitcoin reserve bill or legislation passed in the respective country. Is that going on as well?
Yeah, we've had a lot of inbound from folks in other parts of the world. We've chatted with some lawmakers in Switzerland and Chile and Germany. We've chatted with folks in Canada. There's a lot of folks that are really interested in this stuff, even more nation states than that have put forward some efforts to make it become a reality. So definitely by getting it done here in the U.S., it not only positions the United States as a leader, but other people want to follow what the United States does. Like we are seen as a leader. And when we do something, other parts of the world look at it and go, well, maybe we should do that too. Or maybe we're missing out here. So absolutely by having a strategic Bitcoin reserve at the state level and at the federal level that, we are through executive order, we are leading on this policy perspective. And because we're seen as a resource for strategic Bitcoin reserve legislation, we get reached out to by folks all over the world that want to get it done in their country. So yeah, it's a very exciting time, and we're looking forward to seeing just how far we can take this policy vertical.
Definitely exciting times. So lastly, what message do you have for the people that are Bitcoin advocates, policymakers, or just everyday citizens that want to help support the movement and what you have going on in Satoshi Action?
Best thing they can do is go to the website, satoshiaction.io, and they can sign up for the newsletter right away. Make sure they're staying plugged into what we're doing. And if they like the work that we're doing, they see the wins and they want to keep them coming, they can become a donor. There's places they can donate on the website as well. You can donate dollars, you can donate fiat. We'll put it to great work to make sure that the United States is the absolute best place in the world for Bitcoin and for digital asset users now and for many years into the future. We also do advocacy campaigns too. And we'll launch those and we'll put them out on our email and on our social media. So when we launch those, it gives folks the opportunity to send a letter. We've helped advocates write over 220,000 letters so far in just the last 18 months. We're going to continue helping advocates write letters to their lawmakers. In fact, one of the main reasons that Governor Hobbs signed the bill into law is because so many advocates reached out and wrote letters when we did the advocacy campaign. And that makes a big impact on lawmakers. People don't think it does, but it absolutely does, especially lawmakers that are in tight races. They absolutely read those letters or at least count them, right? This is the one thing I hear from the staff. They're like, sometimes we don't read the letters, but we just take a tally. We see how many pro and how many against. And, if we're on the line or if we're on the fence, that's what makes a difference. We listen to the people if we don't know which direction to go. And so I don't know how big of an effect it had on Governor Katie Hobbs, but when you get hundreds of letters pouring into your inbox that say, we like this thing, and you live in a purple state like Arizona, you think long and hard when that happens, when you decide to sign or veto that legislation. And unfortunately, Governor Katie Hobbs listened to her constituents. I believe that she also made the right decision on smart policy and signed strategic Bitcoin reserve legislation into law for that state. Twitter, you can follow me, Dennis_Porter_. You also have Satoshi Act Fund, which is our social media for the Satoshi Action Fund account. And then if they have any questions, if people want to reach out, they're interested in supporting us or just want to learn more about our work, you can also email us at help@satoshiaction.io.
And we'll put all that information in the description below. And Dennis, once again, I want to thank you for your time.
Absolutely, Sean. Thank you for having me on.